Batman Arkham Asylum is special. It set the example for how superhero games should be made. Before this, Batman games were not mainstream in the slightest. Apart from LEGO Batman, the only other Batman games at the time were not nearly as successful as the Arkham games. So it makes sense as to why some people thought Arkham Asylum was going to flop, and they could have not been more wrong. Because before this, superhero games in general didn't have the greatest reputation. The only other Batman games at the time were things like 2D side-scrollers based off TV shows and movies, which is why so many people were skeptical when this game was released. Then when the game actually came out, people said it was the best superhero game of all time. At least for 2009, of course. And I completely agree. While superhero games have gotten better since Arkham Asylum and now we have plenty of great third-person Batman and Spider-Man games to choose from, we have to understand that these games would not be here without Arkham Asylum. And I think it's perfectly justified to say that this game is objectively the worst because of its age, which isn't a bad thing at all. It's better for a game to be outshined by the sequels instead of the opposite, because games over time are supposed to improve. And just because I said I think it's the worst Arkham game doesn't mean I don't like it. In fact, I've beaten this game about 5 times. So trust me when I say that I like this game a lot. Like I just said, Arkham Asylum might be objectively the worst Arkham game in terms of gameplay and graphics, but that's fine because it was the first game in the series. There weren't any expectations from previous entries because they didn't exist. So it goes without saying that this game not holding up as much as the other games in the franchise is completely justified, since it was the first game in the series. So now we have the other Arkham games, and I want to explain in this video why you should still play this game, because the game is still unique and fun and has a lot to offer in terms of atmosphere, gameplay, side content, and boss fights. The first few minutes are pretty slow, but it's a good way for us to be introduced to the asylum the game takes place in, along with all the characters we'll be meeting and fighting later in the game. You get introduced to all the henchmen and bad guys you'll be fighting, Killer Croc shows up out of nowhere, and the atmosphere in general is spot on. The music and lighting gives you this sense of fear and curiosity that isn't seen in the other Arkham games. You end up getting so caught up in the atmosphere and scenery that when you actually start playing and fighting people, you get a little caught off guard. There isn't much to say about the story because it's pretty simple and basic, which makes sense because they're making an original story here, so they wanted to play it safe and see how players reacted. And I guess it's kind of a trade-off in a way compared to the other games. The stories in Arkham City, Origins, and Night were more entertaining and complex, but that meant they had more plot holes because of how many different pieces there were to those stories. Arkham Asylum has a much safer story but isn't quite as interesting to talk about. And for the most part, the gameplay still holds up pretty well. Not as much as the other games in the series, but that's to be expected. While you can glide at this game, you cannot dive bomb, the controls are inverted, and you don't get a grapple boost. Those things, like many other features, would come later in the series. The brute enemies are pretty easy to go up against on their own. All you have to do is throw a batarang at them and get out of the way. Then when they're distracted, you wail on them a couple times until they're knocked out. On their own, this isn't really much of a challenge, and I think the game developers realized this because after fighting 1 or 2 of these guys on their own, they start getting grouped in with normal enemies. And they work way better that way, because fighting one of these guys with no one else around is actually just having you standing still most of the time. There's not much actual movement involved. In terms of what options we have when fighting, you got the bare essentials like a normal punch and a counterattack, and when it comes to add-ons you have special attack, throws, and also ground attack. Just these 3 moves are enough to make the player feel like they always have options when playing. Each move feels equally effective, so it just comes down to personal preference when fighting. You could temporarily knock down 2 people with a throw, permanently take out 1 enemy with a special attack, or permanently take out an enemy with a ground takedown. Except the catch with a ground takedown is it leaves you exposed for a short amount of time, meaning it's risky to use if anyone is close by. Early on in the game, you're also introduced to high security enemies who can't be hurt with normal attacks and also can't be properly countered. So instead of just hitting them 1 or 2 times, you'll have to stun them first to get your hits in. And if they try to attack you first, your only option is to jump out of the way, either around them or over their head. This enemy type can be annoying to deal with, but in a good way. It provides a much needed challenge for the combat, because without this enemy type, the combat would get too easy early on in your playthrough. The same thing applies for enemies who have tasers. Your only option to attack these guys is from behind. All of these different enemy types force the player to get creative, because if you just fought default enemies the entire time, chances are people would start noticing how easy the game got. Another great way this game balances difficulty is with the hard mode, which is what I played on. If you played the Arkham games a lot, you probably noticed that there isn't any blue indicator near the enemy's heads when they're about to throw a punch. And that's because when playing this game on the highest difficulty, the game takes this indicator away. And this makes a huge difference when playing because sometimes I'll get hit because I didn't notice an enemy was trying to attack me simply because the indicator wasn't there. This forces me to engage more and pay more attention to my surroundings, which is a good thing. You want to provide the perfect level of challenge when playing a video game, because if the game's too easy, you'll get bored and stop playing, and if the game's too hard, you'll rage quit and once again stop playing. Either way, you're gonna quit. Having the perfect difficulty for for a game is exactly what you need to make sure players stay interested with your product, and that is one of the game's biggest strengths. Stealth in this game is pretty fun, if not kinda limited, since this was before things like vents, windows, and other type of takedowns were introduced to the series. So most of the time you're just going to be doing inverted takedowns or silent takedowns. It's good and gets the job done, but obviously doesn't stand as strong as the stealth in the other games. Boss fights in this game are a mixed bag, because while some of them test your skills or double as awesome set pieces, others are too easy or just normal fights with slight variations. Scarecrow's boss fight wasn't too hard, but was also serving as a set piece at the same time to scare the player, showing off Batman's greatest fears like his parents failing to save someone he knows or being crazy enough to be locked up in the asylum himself. All of these things are explored in the game's scripted sequences. The first time you face Scarecrow, it's pretty easy since you just need to make sure he doesn't see you, but later on when you face him again and again, it adds more platforming and actual combat. I wouldn't like this boss nearly as much if it wasn't for the hallucinations and combat during each fight, cause otherwise the fight just wouldn't be nearly as interesting or engaging. Watching Batman walk down an endless hallway only for it to slowly transition into Crime Alley was pretty impactful. Rewatching the beginning cutscene with the roles reverse definitely caught me off guard the first time I played it. Also, this cell showing off the crazy version of Batman was a nice detail. The boss fight with Bane is pretty basic. It's just the same as fighting against a brute enemy except with more health. So all you do is throw a batarang and get out of the way while fighting normal enemies at the same time. I honestly hesitate to say that Harley Quinn would even classify as a boss fight, because when going up against her, all you do is fight normal enemies once again and don't even fight Harley herself. The only difference between the boss and a normal group of enemies is that the platforms will shock you if you stay on one for too long. Apart from that, it's just a normal fight. The Killer Croc boss fight, while scarier than the rest, isn't all that challenging. I'll admit, there's a certain level of tension and buildup when you actually go up against him, because every time you slowly make your way through the sewers waiting for him to pop up right in front of you, but the fighting itself just boils down to you walking, then standing still, and throwing one single batarang until Croc pops up again. And occasionally you'll have to sprint for a short amount of time. That's really all there is to this fight. It's not too hard, it's not too complicated, but it's still entertaining. Poison Ivy's boss fight is probably my favorite because it was the most challenging and engaging. The fight actually forces you to be mindful of your surroundings instead of just pressing one or two buttons to progress. You have to make sure you aren't caught by Ivy's vines and while fighting enemies in whatever space is left over on the platform, along with having to perfectly time a batarang throw to actually do some damage. And I honestly would rather have this be the final boss instead of Joker, because Joker's boss fight is pretty underwhelming. All you do is run away for maybe 10 seconds, fight normal enemies, then wail on Joker when he can't move. You don't actually fight Joker himself that much. When asking the question, does Batman Arkham Asylum still hold up, it's important to understand that it holds up but just not as much as the sequels. But what about on its own? What if you just pretend the other games don't exist when playing Arkham Asylum? I would say if you played this game without touching Arkham City, Origins, or Knight, this game will end up exceeding your original expectations just like it did for people back in 2009. The game's atmosphere and visuals still hold up. Combat, while being slow and a little simple at times, is still fun. Boss fights, while not always challenging, are still entertaining. And the story, while not too complex or extremely interesting, it is at least serviceable and gets the job done. If you've never played any of the Arkham games, I highly recommend you start with this one. Not just because it's the first one to release, but also because it serves as the perfect introduction to the series and what it has to offer. So once you start playing the sequels later on, you can appreciate those games way more. And if it wasn't for this game, we wouldn't even have the other Arkham games or even the recent Spider-Man games. This game was a stepping stone that set the gold standard for what superhero games should strive to be.